Most people assume the CIA recruits Delta Force operators to keep doing what they already do, kicking doors, hunting targets, running direct action. Man spends a decade in the most elite counterterrorism unit on Earth. CIA notices, CIA calls. Simple transaction. The skills go with the man. That assumption is wrong. Not slightly wrong, fundamentally wrong. When the CIA recruits a Delta Force operator, they're not buying a shooter. They're buying a mind, and then spending the next roughly 18 months trying to rewire it. The things that made a man exceptional at Delta Force, the speed, the violence of action, the binary clarity of every decision, those qualities are useful, but they're not what the CIA is recruiting for. The CIA is recruiting for something that Delta Force spent years training out of a man. The transition from Delta Force operator to CIA Paramilitary Operations Officer is one of the most unusual professional reinventions in American national security. The men who make it don't just change jobs. They change the fundamental architecture of how they operate in the world. The ones who don't adapt, the ones who bring Delta thinking to a CIA problem, tend to wash out, or worse, cause the kind of damage that surfaces 15 years later in a congressional report. What actually happens to Delta Force operators after the CIA comes calling is a story most people have completely backwards. The CIA's Special Activities Center, SAC, is the covert action arm of the Directorate of Operations. Within it, the Special Operations Group runs 3 operational departments: Ground Branch for land-based paramilitary work, Maritime Branch, drawing heavily from former DevGru and SEAL pipelines, and Air Branch. Ground Branch has, over the course of several decades, shifted toward recruiting predominantly from Delta Force and the broader JSOC community. The reason is simple. The most complex covert problems the United States faces require men who have already proven they can operate with minimal guidance, adapt in real time, and make irreversible decisions without a chain of command holding their hand. But the SAC is not large. The entire Special Operations Group operates with well fewer than 200 officers. Some estimates put active Ground Branch paramilitary operators at closer to 100 at any given time. That scarcity means the CIA can afford to be extraordinarily selective. Recommending a candidate means putting your own credibility behind him. Most men who end up in front of a CIA recruiter got there because someone already inside vouched for them personally. The stakes of getting it wrong are not abstract. The CIA Memorial Wall at Langley Headquarters in Virginia currently bears 140 stars carved into white Alabama marble, each one representing an officer who died in service. Paramilitary Operations Officers from the Special Activities Center are believed to account for a significant portion of those stars. The CIA does not publish a breakdown by role. The Book of Honor beneath the wall lists their names when classification allows, but some stars sit above blank lines, because even in death, the US government denies their existence. Larry Freedman is one of the men on that wall. Freedman served in Delta Force from 1978 to 1982, having come up through the 5th Special Forces Group and 2 tours in Vietnam that earned him 2 Bronze Stars and a Purple Heart. He joined the CIA in 1990, late in his career by any measure. By December 1992, he was in Somalia, conducting special reconnaissance in advance of the US military's amphibious entry. Alone, in a vehicle, on a route no American had cleared. His vehicle hit a landmine on December 23rd. He was 51 years old. The CIA awarded him the Intelligence Star posthumously on January 5, 1993. His eulogy at Fort Bragg's chapel cited Isaiah. "I heard the Lord say, 'Who shall I send, and who will go for us?' I answered, 'Here I am, send me.'" That's the population of men the CIA is drawing from. And that's what the CIA is asking them to become. The transition starts well before anyone signs anything. Delta Force and CIA Ground Branch operate in overlapping environments, joint targeting packages, shared intelligence products, operations where a JSOC assault element and a CIA Ground Branch team are working the same compound from different angles. That proximity is deliberate. It functions as an extended audition that neither party formally acknowledges. A recruiter doesn't cold call a Delta Sergeant Major out of a database. By the time the conversation happens, The CIA officer has already watched the candidate operate. He's reviewed after-action reports. He's asked around inside the community. The men who get approached are already known quantities. That's the first filter, and it's invisible to almost everyone outside the loop. If a candidate is interested, the formal process begins. It includes an extended background investigation that makes the Delta Force access process look cursory. Financial history, foreign contacts, family ties. Everything examined in granular detail over months. There's a polygraph. For men accustomed to institutional trust, to operating inside a chain of command that largely treats them as credentialed professionals, the polygraph is often their first real encounter with a kind of institutional suspicion they're not prepared for. The CIA trusts no one by default. That's not a cultural tick. It's a structural requirement of an organization that runs human assets in denied environments. Once a candidate clears the hiring pipeline, the formal training begins. Blue-badged Paramilitary Operations Officers, actual CIA employees, as distinct from contracted green badge operators, go through the clandestine service trainee program. The CST runs roughly 18 months. It starts at Camp Peary, a 9,000-acre facility near Williamsburg, Virginia, that the agency has operated since the early 1950s. Everyone calls it the farm. A Delta Force Sergeant Major arriving at the farm for his first week discovers immediately that nothing here works the way he expects. Delta selection filters for men who perform under physical duress. The farm filters for something different: the ability to perform under social and psychological ambiguity. No enemy combatants, no compound diagrams, and no assault timelines. Instead, there are other recruits and surveillance and scenarios designed to expose how a man behaves when he doesn't know who's watching or why. The farm runs recruits through what the CIA calls clandestine tradecraft: surveillance detection routes, counter-surveillance, asset identification and recruitment, the 6-step SADRAT cycle: spot, assess, develop, recruit, run, terminate, that governs how an operations officer turns a foreign national into a working intelligence asset. For a man whose entire professional identity has been built around kinetic operations, this is a genuine cognitive challenge. Delta Force operators do not manage relationships, they manage threats. Managing a threat is a problem with a defined solution set. Managing a relationship is a problem with no solution at all. Only an ongoing negotiation with a human being who has his own interests, his own fears, and his own reasons for doing what he does. The farm also runs recruits through surveillance scenarios using a fictional country called Vertania, with a mock embassy, a town square, and simulated CNN broadcasts. Everything is watched, always, by CIA psychologists and evaluators who are measuring how recruits behave when they believe they're off the clock. For operators from a unit where identity, rank, and role are clearly defined, operating in an environment where no one will tell you who you are or what the rules are is genuinely disorienting. Some don't adapt. They get sent home. The men who pass the farm move on to the second phase. SAC Paramilitary Officers complete additional training at Harvey Point, a facility the Department of Defense officially owns and the CIA operationally controls, situated on a peninsula along Albemarle Sound outside Hertford, North Carolina. Harvey Point is where the explosives work happens: demolitions, ballistics, vehicle interdiction, foreign weapons systems. For Delta operators, Harvey Point feels familiar in a way the farm did not. The work is physical, the skills are technical, the feedback is immediate. Men relax. That's partly the point. The CIA is watching how operators handle the return to a comfort zone after months of deliberate psychological dislocation. By the time a former Delta operator finishes, he is certified as a clandestine intelligence officer, meaning he can recruit and handle foreign assets, write intelligence reports, and conduct human intelligence operations, while retaining his existing direct action skills. The CIA calls this a Paramilitary Operations Officer, because neither title alone captures what the job actually is. A PMU is expected to run a guerrilla operation in the morning, meet with a foreign intelligence partner in the afternoon, and write a cable for Langley by nightfall. The operational reality of working under Title 50 authority, the legal framework governing CIA covert action, as distinct from the Title 10 authority governing conventional military operations, means that if a PMU is captured or killed during an operation, the U.S. government can deny the mission ever happened. No uniforms, no insignia, no military ID. If something goes wrong, the official position is that he was never there. Delta Force operators operate in classified environments, but they still carry military identification. They still exist in the unclassified world. The transition to CIA status removes that last layer of institutional identity. A man who spent 20 years inside one of the most closely bonded professional communities in the American military becomes, legally and operationally, a ghost. Some men find that liberating. Others find it profoundly isolating. The community that defined them, the operators they trained with, the men they trusted with their lives, is now a world they can no longer fully participate in. They can't talk about their current work. They can't explain their employer. They can't compare notes at the bar after a deployment the way they once did. The quiet professional culture of Delta Force, where men operate in anonymity by institutional tradition, turns out to be poor preparation for the deeper anonymity the CIA requires. In Delta Force, the men inside the wire know who you are and what you've done. In the CIA, some of them don't either. The common assumption is that the psychological challenge is getting a warrior to think like a spy, learning patience, learning to work indirectly, learning to achieve things through manipulation rather than force. That's real, but it's not the hardest part. The hardest part is what the CIA calls the dual role requirement, and it exposes a vulnerability in Delta Force operators that their entire career has worked to conceal. A Delta Force operator's professional identity is built on certainty. Selection filters for men who produce consistent results under extreme conditions. The culture reinforces that consistency at every level. When a Delta Sergeant Major makes a call, it sticks. The team trusts it. A decade inside that environment produces a man who is, by design, highly confident in his own judgment and deeply resistant to ambiguity. Those qualities are survival traits in direct action environments. They become liabilities in intelligence work. A Paramilitary Operations Officer must hold two different professional identities simultaneously: the kinetic operator who can lead a direct action mission, and the case officer who can sit across a table from a foreign source and create conditions for that source to betray his own country. Those two skill sets require different cognitive orientations. Direct action rewards decisiveness. Asset recruitment rewards patience, ambiguity tolerance, and the ability to subordinate your ego to whatever the source needs to feel in order to keep talking. Former CIA officers who've written about ground branch programs describe the most common failure mode for Delta operators in the agency as an experience gap problem. Men exceptional at executing missions, but struggling in the intelligence collection role because their entire career rewarded the opposite cognitive style. The farm identifies these men quickly. The scenarios are designed specifically to surface that tension. What actually separates the Delta operators who thrive in the CIA from those who wash out isn't tactical skill. Everyone who walks through the door has tactical skill. It's the willingness to be wrong and not know it. Intelligence operations run on incomplete information. Asset reliability is never certain. A source productive for 3 years can be doubled by a foreign service, and you may not find out for months. The men who succeed are the ones who can hold genuine uncertainty about whether their work is having the effect they believe and keep operating anyway, without the immediate feedback loop that combat provides. The CIA is not looking for a Delta Force operator who has learned patience. It is looking for a Delta Force operator who has made peace with never knowing. There's a wall at CIA headquarters in Langley with 140 stars carved into white marble. Most Americans will never see it. Most of the names beneath those stars spent years operating in places the US government officially never sent anyone. Some stars don't have names at all. The men who make the Delta to CIA transition are choosing to step further into the shadow. The institutional recognition that comes with a career in the most elite counterterrorism unit in the American military gives way to something with no external markers, no insignia, no official acknowledgement, no record anyone will read. What drives men to make that choice doesn't have a clean answer. It isn't money, it isn't status, because the status becomes invisible. The most credible explanation, the one that surfaces in the accounts of men who made the transition and later spoke about it, is that the mission itself becomes the only thing left. When you strip away every external marker of identity, what remains is the work, whether the outcome is worth the cost. Larry Freedman gave his answer to that question. He said it out loud before leaving for Somalia. If there's any way I want to go, it's doing it. The men who follow that path aren't chasing glory. They gave up on glory a long time ago. If this is the kind of content you're here for, the real structure behind the units most people only know by reputation, subscribe. There's more where this came from.